السر منا لا تهتك الستر عنا وعافنا واعف عنا وكلنا حيث كنا.
Let us begin inshallah. Al-Fatiha biniyati man wa aslafna salihin biniyati hifdhi zahir wal batin wa bi anna Allah yanawwiru qulubana wa qawalibana ma'a tuqa wal huda wal afaf wal ghina wal mauti ala dinil Islam wal iman bila mihnati wal imtihan bihaqqi sayyidi waladi adnan wa likulli niyatin salihah wa ila hadratin nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam bisirra surar al-Fatiha. A'udzu billahi minasyaitonir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin arrahmanir rahim. Wa iyyaka nasta'in. If I speak like this, will you be able to hear me? Yes? Sorry, today is I'm away from home, so we'll have to try some unconventional means to to host this program. At any rate, Alhamdulillah, we are in our last session on contemporary philosophy and our response towards it. Of course, the last time we discussed the development of philosophy during the Enlightenment period. I believe we touched on David Hume and his and the rise of empirical philosophy from Locke, of course. But Hume, I suppose, rendered empirical philosophy or rendered the rational metaphysics that was the previous century's inclination a devastating critique. Yes, of course, he went very deep in his critique to the extent that he challenged very fundamental notions of metaphysics such as substance, cause and effect, and instead substituted rationalist metaphysics with what then is called the theory of impressions and ideas. And we went to see how the empirical philosophy of Hume had implications for moral philosophy, in which he built a new conception of ethics based on moral sentiments. We then followed through the flowering of Enlightenment philosophy, which was Immanuel Kant, by giving a brief description of his critique of pure reason, which is summarized in the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, about the transcendental philosophy, meaning to say the notion of the noumena and the phenomena, and how his philosophy is intended to save philosophy of science while at the same time rejecting the claim of metaphysics. And briefly, we also went into Kant's ethics, particularly his notion of the categorical imperative and how he built from the notion of practical reason the foundation of, say, belief in God from, say, the moral argument. After Immanuel Kant, I think in the 19th century and then on to the 20th century, Wilhelm Windelband thought that philosophy seems to take a back seat. Philosophy in the late 19th and the early 20th century gradually became outdone by the development of the natural sciences and the other disciplines such as history. Psychology came to liberate itself from philosophy, and of course this development, the exponential growth of the sciences, made philosophy question its own, shall we say, raison d'etre. In the medieval period, philosophy had a special position as the handmaiden of theology, meaning to say theology which was derived from the self-revelation of God through scripture, had, shall we say, creedal statements that we can derive from self-revelation of God. But the purpose of philosophy thereby is to explicate, elaborate these claims and defend them. Much like in the same manner as the initial understanding of Kalam, via nazar to true faith, in that sense, meaning to say nazar or the akal is used in service of the claims of revelation. So after the close of the Middle Ages, as we said, as we discovered during the Renaissance with this rediscovery of the ancient sources, gradually the self-conscious strengthening of the secular civilization challenge challenge theology, or the right of theology to defend the truth of Scripture, until eventually even revelatory theology became superseded or replaced at first with shall we say, natural theology in the case of Descartes, wherein he sought to defend certain premises of faith or certain premises of the Christian religion using rational means alone, until eventually, with Kant's critique of metaphysics, even the theological claims now are rendered, shall we say, beyond the cans of human reason. So in the 19th century, as the immediate heirs of, or the immediate inheritors of Immanuel Kant, one was his direct student, yes, Fichte. Uh, in Germany, followed a century of what we call the German idealists or German idealism, in which they sought to focus on developing a systematic philosophy based on the transcendental intuition of Immanuel Kant. So we have, for example, in Schelling and its culmination in Hegel, a notion of, say, for example, an understanding of history as the developmental process, an understanding of history as a means of manifestation of the absolute, the gradual manifestation of the absolute, that history was a sort of march or progress towards ever greater perfection. Now that century of idealism, I shall not go too much into this particular discussion, but perhaps in the later series when we go deeper, we can allocate a particular discussion on German idealism. But we'll put a pin there so as to follow the other developments that leads to contemporary philosophy. The other, I think, major contender, major thinker that left an imprint on the history of philosophy is, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche, which is very difficult to escape. He is, so to speak, he does not offer a systematic metaphysics per se. His is more of a philosophy of values, but yet his critique, his insights into psychology, his insights into the nature and limits of philosophy, I think is very pertinent. One of the things that he managed to expose, at least as it pertains to the history of Western philosophy, was that many of the modern philosophers, be it Spinoza, Descartes, and even Kant himself, according to him, the best philosophies are but an involuntary presentation of your memoir, or rather, it is your own personality made abstract. In other words, if you look at, say, the system of Thomas Hobbes, for example, uh, supposing his notion of sovereignty, why he wanted to cede all power to the sovereign, giving much power to the state, taking it away from individuals, is due to his own biases, his own prejudices, his own personal experience in life, having seen the result of the great wars of the factions and the schisms between Christianity. Locke, with a different type of personality, but sharing the same historical milieu, albeit a bit later, opted instead for a notion of state that celebrates toleration, that celebrates liberty and freedom. Likewise, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with his notion of the social contract, also wanted to celebrate the individual, particularly because of his own inclination towards feelings. So in other words, Nietzsche's, I think, major discovery is how, with the collapse of metaphysics, perhaps he did not say it such a way, but with the collapse of metaphysics, subjectivity reigns supreme. In other words, it becomes a revival of what Protagoras used to say, that man is the measure of all things. What we mean is that if there is no metaphysical, meaning to say beyond physics, beyond the subject, beyond humanity, if there is no author of existence, if there is no sovereign who legislates and gives us the things that is intended for human good, then what is left is the human subject. This is the notion of how man becomes God in that sense. which is why another dramatization of the the situation that was affecting European thought was Nietzsche's statement that God is dead, that none other than human beings have killed him. In particular, the development of Western metaphysics or the development of Western philosophy, so as to reject the ethics, the metaphysics of Christianity. With the death of God, in other words, with the death of the guidance of religion, man is left unto himself. Except that for Nietzsche, he wants to say that his is a philosophy that is at least honest to this fact. Kant, according to Nietzsche, he disguises that his own personal preference under this philosophic notion of the categorical imperative, of the idea of the afterlife, and the notion of the existence of God, and the truth of moral statements, in spite of his own admission that this cannot be known by pure reason, that this becomes something that you merely assume in order to preserve the categorical imperative. So for Nietzsche, he becomes, in a sense, the destroyer of these metaphysical systems. He went, in a sense, even beyond Hume, because I mean, his critique on the empiricists is that the empiricists, Pace Hume, including, of course, John Stuart Mill, Bentham, and so on, that they are very good, shall we say, researchers, or they are very good, say, thinkers when it comes to individual sciences. In other words, when they focus on an atomistic aspect of reality, they can do the proper work of, say, analysis and highlighting this particular phenomena while excluding their own, say, moral judgment. But for Nietzsche himself, what he wants is to lay bare the results of the collapse of metaphysics and see through the effects in the ethical realm, what he calls the transvaluation of all values. And this is what his major project was, especially that can be seen in the Twilight of the Idols, and also in his Beyond Good and Evil. In Beyond Good and Evil, I suppose, is one of his one of the mature presentation of his thought, because he begins by a challenge, that is as systematic as he gets. Because in his more poetic work, more literary work, the Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he presents in a more literary manner his ideas in poetic and parables. But in the Beyond Good and Evil, although the aphoristic style is preserved, but yet it is at least arranged in, shall we say, in paragraphs and in chapters whereby particular thought patterns and are arranged accordingly. So he challenges, for example, he advances a notion of what we call the genealogy of morality. So meaning to say, to study whether a morality, supposing you explode the metaphysical claims, what remains is but what he calls the will to power. In other words, either your strategy for overcoming the challenges of life is the strategy of the strong, which therefore will be exhibited in the things that you value. In other words, the one that a morality that celebrates excellence, celebrates hierarchy in existence, celebrate what he calls the ladder of being, in which those who are talented, those who possess, say, prowess, both physical and thought and in artistic expression, deserves, shall we say, to paint on the canvas of society. Or you prefer what he called the sickness of Socrates, the sickness of Plato, and the meek ethics of Christianity, the one that prefers the mediocre, the one that prefers the rule of the weak against the strong. So therefore, it promotes a certain type of morality that promotes, shall we say, pity, that promotes egalitarianism and the leveling of people. So that's Nietzsche's, shall we say, ethical critique. At the same time, we must know that what Nietzsche is really confronting with his realization, his was a very intense soul, shall we say. His feeling was the understanding of the implication of the collapse of metaphysics is the impending challenge of nihilism. Yes, the impending challenge of nihilism, meaning to say the notion that supposing there is no meaning, supposing now we can no longer find meaning in reality, that it is not handed down by religion, that you cannot discover it through philosophy. Supposing there is no meaning, this nihilism, it becomes a threat. It leads to, in Kierkegaardian terms and later on in Heidegger's term, it leads to something called angst. Existence becomes a burden because you suffer the threat of nothingness. You suffer the threat of, as we said, nihilism, meaning to say the notion of meaninglessness. So his presentation of the discovery of this understanding of this meaninglessness that ever threatens the happiness, or that ever threatens the psychological makeup of man. Now for him, he wants to shall we say, to elaborate a style of philosophy that affirms life, the one that allows you to overcome the challenge of nihilism. And for this, he presented the vision of several, say, metaphysical claims, although it is not known whether or not seriously he subscribes to them or not. Meaning to say, amongst the claim is this notion of eternal recurrence, the idea that everything in existence, everything that we experience, have been eternally happening, and it will eternally recur. So we should live life, as Nietzsche was saying, which we should live life as if we would like for it to repeat. Meaning to say, it is a celebration of the powers of life, a celebration of the of life affirming principles, and the ones who are most successful in obtaining this is a future race that he has in mind. And this he calls the Uberman, the Superman or the Overman, those who have overcome the present day challenges. So his is more of a personal philosophy, an ethical philosophy, um, with the canvas of nihilism and nothingness behind. At the same time, as we know, if we study the history of science contemporaneously with the history of philosophy, after the Newtonian picture, mechanistic world picture based on his Principia, several developments happened, especially in the geological realms, in which they discovered that the Earth and the universe, shall we say, is much older than what the previous generations have thought. This allows for the thought of evolution to develop. Charles Darwin proposed the notion of, say, the theory of evolution and natural selection, and several other, shall we say, theoretical creativity, theoretical hypotheses to suggest that organisms have been developing from simpler forms until it reaches higher and higher forms using the mechanisms just described. The geological discovery certainly aided the idea that the time period which is required for this modification of the smallest type, aided by the facility of natural selection. Certainly, as there were several thinkers who were at work here, including Lamarck, including, of course, Ricardo, and several other thinkers who combine together the notion of this, shall we say, that organisms tend to produce themselves more than what nature provides. So therefore, nature will trim the unfit. So this notion of the development of the survival of the fittest, with the other mechanisms, allow for this notion of the evolution. The theory of evolution, certainly, if one subscribed, and it had great proponents and defenders during that century, would lead a fatal blow to theism, even more so than the Copernican revolution in the 16th century. So the rise of the theory of evolution certainly changed the world picture. Already Kant has prepared the the Copernican revolution in philosophy and the denial of metaphysics. Now, with the rise of say evolutionary biology, it has a tendency to impact all the other disciplines, including philosophy and psychology. Thinkers such as Spencer, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, the English and those who worked in the British Isles, these philosophers were much more, shall we say, scientific men, in a sense that they focus on the philosophical implications of the discovery of science, and gradually that sort of relationship became established. Modern philosophy now, say, remove of its claims and powers, becomes subdued. Philosophy then becomes a mere, shall we say, the role of philosophy is to merely rearrange and discuss the implications of the findings of science, until eventually they came to the realization that science was the sole authentic knowledge. Philosophy, rather, is a mere extension of that activity. It is the activity of man trying to find meaning in the discoveries of the natural sciences. So that's why gradually new theories of ethics became developed, until eventually the ethical, the Christian and the metaphysical backgrounds became juxtaposed, became removed from the consciousness of man, and they became more and more enthused to come up with ever new ethical theories based on, say, notions of happiness, consequentialism, and so on. Now, let us look a bit at the development as a result of this shall we say, new discovery, new development, and the growth of science. What then is left for philosophy to do? Within this trajectory, in the early 20th century, of course, you had the divide between continental philosophy and the analytic tradition amongst the English-speaking people. Amongst the English-speaking people, you had some sort of a different direction, say, provisionally in America, in the case of the pragmatists, and this particularly due to the strength of the likes of William James and several other thinkers within that school of philosophy, the pragmatists. James, I think, is noteworthy not only for his work in psychology. He has the principles of psychology that continue to shape and define modern psychology, but also in terms of his very well documented study on the varieties of religious experience, wherein he studied the different types of intuition and what is the significance of, say, religious experiences, spiritual or otherwise, within the context of modern psychology. And then, of course, we know that at the same time, we had the rise of Sigmund Freud and his, shall we say, analysis of dreams, and his psychology that tries even to answer some philosophical questions, including about the existence of God, what he calls the future of an illusion. And he did also write about civilization. So this then becomes a sort of a mental picture of what's happening in the late 19th and the 20th century. Another major development, I suppose, that needs to be mentioned here, that builds on the works of Hume, Bentham, Mill, and Spencer, is the Vienna school of the 20th century, who call themselves the logical empiricists. The Vienna school, I think, perhaps supposing we choose the works of Alfred Jules Ayer to represent what they were thinking about, or to represent the philosophical school, Ayer wrote Language, Truth, and Logic to advance the verificationist theory of meaning. Since they have rejected metaphysics, existence of God, and so on, now what are still genuinely philosophical questions include the question of meaning and the philosophy of language. Meaning to say, in what way are our sentences meaningful? So, for A.J. Ayer, he defines meaningful sentences as sentences that can be empirically verified. Later on, he would distinguish between two types. One is called strong verification and the other a weak type of verification. In other words, statements or sentences are only meaningful insofar as they can be either empirically verified, or you can conceive of some empirical test in which that statement can be verified, or you can conceive, for example, of a possible experiment that can verify the impacts of such phenomena. Using this criteria of meaning, the logical empiricists are trying to restrict statements to that which is the concern of the scientists, and therefore reject claims of religion, reject the claims of ethics and religion and metaphysics in one fell swoop. The result of that, supposing we restrict limiting meaningful sentences to only that which can be verified scientifically, ethics will be one of those disciplines which will have a difficulty to sustain. So therefore, they had to come up with a new theory of ethics. And their theory of ethics is called, at least in the way presented by Alfred Jules Ayer, is called emotivism. Basically, ethical statements are merely statements that you, developing from Hume, of course, that you approve. And say evil or wrong statements are statements that bring about a sort of moral revulsion. In other words, this is the boo hurrah theory. I mean, things which are good and you approve of it, and things. So it says nothing about the possible the truth claims of such a statement, because it's just a statement of aesthetic taste. In other words, you cannot distinguish between statement of ethics and aesthetics. Aesthetics are your claims about beauty, meaning to say beautiful things that agree with your being, and ethical statements are statements that shall we say agree with your ethical predispositions. But this is nothing about whether or not you can state that what a person is doing is wrong, supposing that person do not share your same ethical framework. Meaning to say, it leads to the trouble of unlimited tolerance. So you cannot really judge a person who I mean, because they will claim that that's based on their aesthetic taste, shall we say. But many other philosophers and historians of philosophy will agree that within the analytic tradition, perhaps the greatest and the most important philosopher of the 20th century was Ludwig Wittgenstein. Yes. Wittgenstein is famous primarily for two of his works. One representing his early understanding, summarized by his work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the TLP. We have encountered in Spinoza the TTP, the relationship between theology and politics. Wittgenstein is concerned about the question of logic and philosophy. And in his later works, Philosophical Investigations, both works of Wittgenstein deal mainly with the notion of language and reality, which is the, shall we say, the last hiding place of philosophy. So in his early work, the rather slim TLP, Wittgenstein advances a theory of language which is under the notion of a picture theory of meaning. Accordingly, there are statements that we make in our minds and we express as sentences. And then there is an external world. Meaningful statements, according to Wittgenstein, are statements which are models of reality. And a model of reality is a picture of reality. Of course, this notion of picture is not necessarily a sense image. Yes, that's one notion of picture. But here we need to clear our mind of the notion of picture as sense image, but rather focus on the notion of a picture as a model of what actually happens. So since statements that we make are mirroring that which is an external reality, so the limits of reality, since reality is composed of say objects, according to Wittgenstein, internally, our sentences ought to be able to be divided to mirror that reality. In other words, just as supposing external reality can be divided into its smallest meaningful unit, either the atom or the discoveries of say quantum physics and so on. So similarly, in the theory of meaning, in our minds, the atomistic word would be, shall we say, a word and a predicate. All these things are the basic units of what makes meaningful sentences. You can gather them together to make sentences, but the limits of reality ought to be what can mirror external reality. And he concludes the TLP with this this aphorism, which can be interpreted sometimes mystically also. He said that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. In other words, the limits of reality is what language can describe. Later on, as Wittgenstein would continue to live a fruitful life in various, I mean, he experienced many things after having left academia for quite some time. And when he returned, he taught, the philosophical investigations was published posthumously, meaning after his death. But in there, he advances his own critique of his own early work. Because according to the later Wittgenstein, he understood that, well, there are so many senses of our usage of sentences. The capturing and the mirroring of reality is but one way of the many expressions that human beings adopt. And then he advances anew. So what he did was to analyze further speech acts. Say, for example, what am I doing when I am claiming that so and so is the case? What am I doing when I'm saying that I am in pain? And what am I doing when I'm saying that he is in pain? All these things have implications. And so he studied the various senses of language in a deeper sense. And at the same time, he also advances this notion, therefore, of a language game. So a language game is entered by, say, competent users of language who, in their interactions with each other, understand the grammar and the limits of the language involved. So, in other words, he diversifies meaningful statements, becoming more able to describe the reality that we experience. What then is our response to this? I think Professor Naqib Al-Atas mentions about the philosophy of language. First, his most iconic statement is that in the worldview of Islam, or rather, our view about language is that language reflects ontology. Yes, language reflects ontology. So if Wittgenstein were to say that the world, as he defines in the TLP, is the totality of objects, the world is everything that exists, we can then ask, what is the world to you? And perhaps they will say the world is that which can be sense verified. I don't know if that's in fact what Wittgenstein say, but for us, we affirm that the realm of sense and sensible experience is not the only level of existence. That there are other levels of existence. That we say that there is something called intuition, and intuition, just as our normal levels of normal functioning reason have different levels, intuition also has different levels. And intuitions of existence, therefore, can experience and can explore other higher realms of reality. And furthermore, in another revealing statement by Professor Naqib Al-Atas about language, he said, where language fails, then the mind takes over. And where the mind fails, then the heart takes over. In other words, the Quran, as it presents the vision of reality and truth to mankind, talks about realms which are beyond sense and sensible experience, using metaphors which are understood within the realms of sense and sensible experience. Jannah, Jahannam. It talks about, the Quran talks about the similitude of this life. The Quran gives examples in a manner that is relatable to our day-to-day experience. Now, these all these are parables, are understood as parables, understood as metaphors, which we know that the ultimate reality is only understood by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. In the case of Jannah, for example, we know that the Prophet said that its true description is such that no eyes have ever seen it, and no ears have ever heard of anything like it, and no heart has ever imagined it. Meaning to say that the heart fails to imagine, to conceptualize what it is really like. So in the case of our ontology, it is much wider than the ontology than that which is accepted by Wittgenstein. And again, we can accept the notion of language games, but our language game, as it is played, is played by the Quranic Arabic that has underwent the Islamization process. And the Quranic Arabic that has underwent the Islamization process is the language that is suited to describe reality properly. It is the language that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala has chosen to describe himself. And within the limitations of the language, it is sufficient to express the truth of religion. So that's our basic response to Wittgenstein. There are other developments, of course, in the 20th century. In the continent, in the German-speaking world, amongst the original thinkers was Edmund Husserl, who developed the notion of phenomenology. The idea of phenomenology was what he thought to be the proper subject matter for philosophy, now that the other disciplines have gradually liberated themselves or from philosophy and emptied their contents into the sciences. Phenomenology studies basically the experience of the subject on particular phenomena. Bracketing, yes, bracketing what the other sciences may say about it. In other words, the famous bracketing experience is to describe certain internal programs, certain internal experiences, such as memory, fantasy, such as the experience of fear, and so on and so forth. So phenomenology becomes a discipline that was enthusiastically developed for a while amongst the Europeans, but gradually even some Eastern philosophers also picked up on this notion of phenomenology. They accepted the method, but they changed the content so as to fit with their own pre-philosophical assumptions. That's phenomenology. Of course, his own direct student, Martin Heidegger, focused philosophy on the problem of being, i.e., according to Heidegger, the history of Western philosophy, I mean, thousands of years before him, from Aristotle, had focused on the question of the many senses of existing and the many senses of being, in the sense of the categories of Aristotle and so on. But he said that they have not focused on the notion of being itself. What is being? So the central preoccupation of Martin Heidegger in his major work called Being and Time is to study this major aspect of being. I apologize that in this final session on contemporary philosophy, it is a sort of a touch and go sort of a thing. It is more like a menu of the philosophical schools that are available. I'm doing this because I'm hoping that the more serious students amongst yourselves will go on to do our next level course, so that way we can, if we decide to focus on any of these thinkers, we can go deeper and see where. But at the present juncture, I will just highlight where the schools are going, shall we say, in their own trajectories. Yes. Now, Yes. Now, to continue, uh, these are, I suppose, the major developments. Karl Marx is someone that I have not touched. Karl Marx notion of because the end of the 19th century also led to the birth of sociology as a serious discipline, the study of societies, historical sociology also, the history of societies, and the disciplines of the social sciences grew out of the historical disciplines, including political economy and greater studies of the nuances and the shall we say the dynamic aspects of society. So the rise of sociology can be attributed to some very familiar names, such as Karl Marx himself, um, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, those who study history and society in order to derive, say important rules that will inform their own specific disciplines. Now, these thinkers, Karl Marx, for example, his focus was on the notion of dialectical materialism. At least that's where his historical thought tended towards. The idea that reversing the Hegelian notion of the dialectic of ideas tending towards perfection, Marx's notion overturned it. He was speaking about what is called the base and the superstructure. The superstructure are ideas that is built on the base, which is human beings, the human individual or the collective relationship to means of production. So Marx developed this idea that ideologies, philosophies, religions, and so on, these are they follow your 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 social relations. They follow your class, shall we say? And class consciousness is a necessity in order to be able to reverse the engines of history or to turn it and so on. uh, we have until today brilliant Marxists who have developed of the notion of what we call neo-Marxism unto its logical ends and continue today, especially in order to critique capitalism. Finally, of course, within the analytic tradition, as we mentioned just now, political philosophy developed. You had the school of liberal political philosophy. So there are so many things to follow within the tradition of contemporary philosophy. But to reduce it to shall we say several principles, philosophy gradually became um, technical. Philosophy became technical. It became an academic discipline concerned with specific problems, unlike what it was in the earlier conceptions of philosophy. Philosophy was thought of within the Christian tradition as a means of clarifying your conviction, as well as in the Islamic intellectual tradition. In Greece, philosophy became the guide to reality. But in the present time, if you look at philosophy departments, especially in the English-speaking world, you will find that they deal with small aspects, either, for example, the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of physics, meaning to say they study specific aspects of the discipline that still brings about a philosophical question. Some of them deal with metaphysical questions, but these two define within the limits of the analytic tradition. Only, shall we say, two exceptions to this course are the Catholic philosophical tradition, and the other, of course, the Islamic intellectual tradition. Um, not including, of course, the other world traditions, insofar as they have dealt with the present problem of philosophy. In the case of the Catholic philosophical tradition, interestingly, the Catholic philosophical tradition, after, say, Antoine Arnauld, Malebranche, and several of the early modern Catholic thinkers, it grew into silence for 150 years or more, until about 1750, or perhaps even more. The thinker of note towards the end of the 19th century was John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman, I think, is important for, first, of course, he is well known for his writing on the idea of the university, a reconceptualization of the university, a critique of the present universities in his time, to return the function of university to study universal knowledge. But also, he had written on the notion of the development of Christian dogma. And these are very important concepts within the history of Christian philosophy. In the case of Newman, he was made cardinal by Pope Leo the 14th, I believe. Pope Leo is an important figure for the revival of Catholic philosophy. Pope Leo wrote the encyclical called the Aeterni Patris. In this encyclical, which is to define the role of Catholic philosophy from the late 19th century until 1998, or maybe somewhere in between, Pope Leo realized, or in that encyclical, he mentioned that a lot of the major errors of the 19th century stem from errors in thinking. Aside from the socio-economic errors, this includes the error of giving too much power to states, and also the intellectual error of admitting that only science is the sole guide to knowledge. So, knowing therefore the perilous consequences of wrong thinking, Pope Leo in Aeterni Patris reinitiated, and after having made Newman cardinal, he also initiated the study of philosophy, except that for the Catholic tradition, for Pope Leo, he thought that the Catholic tradition is Thomistic, ought to be Thomistic in nature. So that's how the study of Thomism became revived. And that's how Neo-Thomism, with its various shades, became a preoccupation in the 20th century. Many of the 20th century important thinkers in the history of Catholic tradition were Thomistic, were Neo-Thomists. Of course, they had, as Neo-Thomists, they had different shades. Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain, I think, are two of perhaps the most brilliant Western thinkers who has criticized the excesses of the Enlightenment, and to be able to bring out what is it that is original and that is useful in the case of the thought of Aquinas. There's some differences between Maritain and Etienne Gilson. Etienne Gilson preferred to highlight the historical background of the thought of Aquinas as part and parcel of his brilliance. Of course, Gilson is also very sophisticated in his unity of philosophical experience. He managed to see the limitations of each philosophical inclination, such as theologism, say spiritualism. All of these philosophical trajectories has its limitations. But at the same time, where Maritain is concerned, his resolution to the problem of knowledge is found in his book called The Degrees of Knowledge, yes, or Degré de Savoir. In Maritain, he subtitled the work Distinguish in Order to Unite. The problem of modern day knowledge, the problem of modern day epistemology, according to Jacques Maritain, is that it has a tendency to employ one epistemology beyond its own realm, and that's the origin of the injustice. Physics is used to judge the statements of metaphysics, and that's an injustice. Biology is used to make claims about the reality of the human identity, and that's an injustice, because biology cannot answer such questions, and so on and so forth. So what, in a brilliant mechanism, what Maritain had done in his Degrees of Knowledge is to outline these different types of epistemologies from biology, physics, and the other special disciplines, in order to distinguish, in order to to suggest this is the limits of knowing within that that particular discipline until he reaches the metaphysical realms. And this approach of Maritain that acknowledges the range of reason will allow for metaphysics breathing space, provided you outline the proper epistemology that can ascertain the claims of metaphysics. In the as the development of the Aeterni Patris, many philosophers left Leo's shall we say suggestion that it has to be Thomistic. We have within in the 20th century several approaches. For example, Anscombe was a disciple of Wittgenstein, and she developed Wittgensteinian themes, but at the same time exploring Catholic religious theistic statements. You had also in the 20th century and in up to our contemporary times, Alvin Plantinga, who developed what is called reformed epistemology within the analytic tradition, focusing on analysis of statements. But Alvin Plantinga revived the notion of warrant, justification, and the revival of the notion of what is called the sensus divinitatis. In other words, the idea that within the epistemic equipment of man is also something akin to what we call the qalb in Islamic epistemology. Meaning to say there is an organ of contemplation, an organ of experience that can ascertain the truth of religious claims also. So within this development, of course, is McIntyre. I think he is one of the brilliant thinkers in our time that we must shall we say, pay attention to if we are interested in the history of philosophy, because he underwent several important phases in his life. If we study, for example, his early works, that is his working within the analytic tradition of ethics. His main concern is the question of ethics. Gradually, he developed the Aristotelian notion of virtue theory to criticize the bankruptcy of modern ethics. Eventually, and he had, of course, a Marxist phase, a leftist phase also, an existentialist phase, until gradually, as he went to recognize in his later ethical work, which is called Whose Justice, Which Rationality, the understanding that rationality and the notion of justice is tied with tradition. Gradually, he moved towards a Catholic understanding. He then studied Aquinas, Newman, and eventually, I think in one of his later works, I think God, Philosophy and Universities, there is where he outlined the history of the Catholic tradition, including how theistic philosophy can revive itself within the notion of the tradition, outlining the works of Aquinas, Bonaventure, several other things in its history, including the Maritain and Gilson, in order to resolve and to engage present-day philosophy. And why I say that Maritain is important to see, to find an analogous reference in our own Islamic intellectual tradition, because within the Islamic intellectual tradition, we must also develop what Dr. Adi Setia, student of Professor Naqib Alatas, has called the Kalam al-Asr, the Kalam of our times. Adi Setia, in his, I think, very brilliant article in that work, the Kalam al-Asr, he briefly surveys our own intellectual tradition and found that there were, in the past, there was the school of Kalam that was initially developed during the time of Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari in response to the Mu'tazilah. Then gradually there were the later Mutakallimin, the Kalam Jadid, yes, represented, of course, by Al-Juwaini, Al-Ghazali, even Fakhruddin Al-Razi, because now Kalam takes into consideration a more expanded epistemology, including Greek logic. Al-Ghazali himself wrote several treatises on logic, the Mihak al-Nadar, the Qistas al-Mustaqim, and of course he wrote the Tahafatul Falasifa, meaning to say able to use the and wield the weapons of the Greek philosophers and affect a criticism of say Hellenistic thought patterns in order to build a new a foundation of Islamic epistemology, making room for intuition, making room for tasawwuf, and so on and so forth. So now in our times, the task of Kalamul Asar um, as Plantinga and as Plantinga as well as McIntyre has outlined their responses to the challenge of secularism and challenges of atheism and secular rationality. In our time also, what Professor Alatas has outlined in his Prolegomena to any future Prolegomena to the metaphysics of Islam, and in his chapter on de-westernization of knowledge, is to study the claims, to study the conclusions, to study the philosophical presuppositions of the individual sciences, including Western philosophy and including the philosophical traditions, in order to sieve through this and to effect a proper work of reconstruction in our time. And with that, having reached 11 a.m., let us see if we have questions. Feel free to ask your questions today, and because otherwise I would have to repeat the aphorism of Wittgenstein, whereof you cannot speak, therefore you must keep silent. Whereof you did not question today, then afterwards you'll have to keep silent. Well, I have here several questions, I see, from Nick Abdul Razak. What's the Islamic philosophical response to the theory of evolution? Well, first, we have to be clear when it comes to a response, a rejoinder, or a critique of a particular theory. Our scholars are careful so as to first define what they understand by the theory. And once their definition is, shall we say, acceptable, then they will see what is problematic with the theory. Or in the case of what I see Professor Naqib Alatas has done in his most recent publication on justice and the nature of man, is to explain within the Quranic explanation of reality what is our view with regards to creation, and particular the creation of man. First, in the Quran, with regards to the creation of man, and this is the particularly problematic aspect of the theory of evolution, the Quran in very clear terms mentioned that Adam was a special creation. He was a special creation. In other words, a special creation meant that his being Adam, his being a man, is as a result of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. In other words, the process of infusing the spirit unto his body. Now that spirit possesses attributes, particularly the attribute of language. And language is our ability to communicate meaning. Language is our ability to absorb meaning either by symbolic representation or by audible symbols, audible signals. So the major criteria, therefore, with regards to the identity of man as God's creation is the ability to understand, the ability to absorb and imbibe meaning. So already, therefore, when we speak of the theory of evolution, on the other hand, their epistemology is not based on revelation, but it is based on a study of what we call the confluence of inductions. They study several disciplines in in a related manner, say embryology, and they study geology, of course, in order to make room for the space that is required, genetics, several other disciplines in order to point out that there are good reasons to make the assent, or there are good reasons to make the tasdeeq that in fact the multiplicity, the variety of the organisms that we perceive today developed from simpler organisms in the past. And of course, in order to explain this, they have developed the theory since Darwin. Darwin did not come up with, say, genetic modification or mutation, but something akin to that was in his mind. But he was more towards natural selection and modification by descent. But for us, we say that, well, must it be in contradistinction to the will of God? In other words, couldn't it be also probable that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our God? Because in the Quran it is stated that that even before the creation of man, the world was already in being. So as Prof. Alatas was explaining, that from time to time, God renews his creation. Meaning to say, from time to time, he diversifies his creation. From time to time, it is he, out of his gift, out of his breath of existence and mercy, that supplies the organisms with what is required for them in terms of rizq, in the external sense, as well as internal rizq, in order to be able to face the external challenges, including, of course, what would promote their survival. What would promote their survival by the modification of, say, the beaks of uh, the birds in the Galapagos Islands, and several other examples. Meaning to say, it is not necessarily a denial of theism to support some version of say, evolution. But we are also aware, as Dr. Adi has pointed out in his article about the critique of, say, the theory of evolution by Michael J. Behe and several other biologists who study who come up with, say, several, shall we say, shukuk, in a sense of creating doubts in the theory of evolution by suggesting, for example, something called irreducible complexity. Of course, to properly advance a critique will require a proper training in the biological sciences. But for us, I think it is sufficient to affirm that thus far it's very difficult to assume that there can be this logical break or this leap that would cross between the the notions of this prehistoric man, which are but hominid figures, and the human being. That difference is not just in degrees. That difference is in kind. And if they say that there are in between human beings and these hominid beings, shall we say, what we call intermediary species, well, let them come with the proofs of that. But we say that the ability of speech, the ability of it is not just memory, because memory is detected in several organisms, including mammals. It is not just imagination, but it is cognition. It is the ability to string and to arrange sentences in meaningful order and pattern. Now that is a radical break from the previous organisms. The next question from Brother Uwais. What would be the proper approach as Muslim students to go about studying sociology, philosophy, and what sciences and foundations are necessary so we can discern what is said by the sociologist, philosopher, right from wrong, and apply it in one's research and study? Of course, to answer this question properly, we have to, as we have done, but in a very rudimentary manner in this history of philosophy course, is to expose ourselves to the many different ways of epistemology of peoples in the past. In other words, one of the novelists used to say, the past is a different country. They do things quite differently there. The aim of this particular course, the History of Philosophy Level 1, it is it was developed from a previous series which I have done with among some of my friends in CASIS. It was called the major movements in the history of philosophy. It is not meant to be the appreciation of the details within each period, but it is meant to give us an overview in a sort of broad stroke to see what was happening in Islamic epistemology, to see what was happening in the Renaissance period, in the medieval and in the ancient, in the Hellenistic period, so as to make us aware of the various significations. And studying history of philosophy, in other words, with the intention of studying the history of epistemology, is extremely important for the modern day student of sociology. I have in mind a particular example in the realm of ethics. After the bankruptcy of modern ethics with emotivism and the notion of shall we say evolutionary ethics, some political philosophers and ethicists in our time started to realize that none of these will give us any clue so as to be able to respond to our ethical challenges in our time. So when they resorted back to studying the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle, they found out that Aristotle and Plato had far more relevant distinctions which are necessary for the ethical life than what can be provided by the modern psychology. So in other words, one way to expand your knowledge, your repertoire, is to expand on these disciplines historically. Yes, to study in the case of Muslims, to study the sociology, philosophy, and whatever sciences that you are employed in, to study how to study what we call the ummahat. In other words, the mutun, or the basic seminal texts that deal with the subject matter that you're dealing with, because in the texts that has been produced in the Islamic intellectual tradition, their epistemology was still derivable from the Quran. So it is how an epistemology that is derived from the Quran, that has been classified in the classification of the sciences based on the Maratibul Ulum. Now within that unity of sciences, they study society. So therefore, the worldview component would still be intact. So that's one way that the sociological student can liberate himself today. The other is, of course, to study Islamic metaphysics. Yes, sorry. To study Islamic metaphysics and to study Islamic ethics, meaning to say our value judgment. So, so this is with the intention of preserving your value structure, and to study, of course, the earliest period after the Prophet, the first, say, 200 years or so, to study the development of the sciences at that time and how they are meant to develop, and then you compare it with your contemporary structure. So these are some of the means through which you can liberate yourself. But if you are still at the beginning of your journey, you do not have to worry that your conclusions might be problematic and your method might be problematic at this particular juncture. You have to be guided by the principle that you want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide you. And with this sincerity, Allah will take you from one step to another step. And I am saying this with the warrant of what Professor Wan Muhammad Noor himself experienced. He who started by studying the concept of knowledge in Islam using, say, a neo-modernistic framework that was at the University of Chicago, informed, of course, by his previous studies in education and curriculum building and instruction. But gradually, with sincerity and with the framework gradually understood, better received, then eventually in his more mature presentation, it becomes ever more polished and ever more intact. So this is my advice to young students like yourself, to have an anchoring in the Islamic intellectual tradition, but at the same time to pursue your present discourse. The mind is is not a tabula rasa. I mean, we disagree with John Locke, who said that the mind is a tabula rasa that allows for facts and data to determine whatever conclusion. The mind rather is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as an active principle. It will be able to discern truth and falsehood, provided it is open to the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the guidance of the earlier scholars. But sincerity is key, I think, in this case. Like Karl Marx, he prioritized welfare, development, and justice for all, especially the proletariat. This is because the bourgeoisie is real in economics worldview through inequality analysis. What is the position of development, human welfare in the view of Islam, political economics, and philosophy? Again, with regards to our view of, say, welfare in Islamic economics or Islamic economic and ethical thought, and of course, again, the scholar to read here is amongst our teachers is Dr. Adi Setia, Dr. Ugi Suharto. What they have done in their surveys into Islamic economic thought is to study how the notion of economics emerges in the Islamic conceptual apparatus. Economics emerges as a branch of ethics. Yes, we have to be clear with that. That economics emerges as a branch of ethics, and ethics is an aspect of what we call the hikmah amaliyah, practical philosophy. Practical philosophy, its aim is prudence. In other words, practical wisdom. The aim of practical wisdom is to achieve and to bring into reality, to manifest the conclusions of theoretical wisdom, the hikmah nadhariyah. So we have to understand, therefore, what are the basic presuppositions of justice in Islam? Yes. What are the presuppositions of the human being in Islam? So we have to study these very fundamental notions, understand these fundamental notions. Yes, what is the meaning of the human being? What is the meaning of happiness? And this is where Professor Alatas begins in the prolegomena. One of the introductions to the metaphysics of Islam deal with the question of happiness. And happiness, or economics, its aim is happiness in the sense of sa'ada. Since happiness is divided into what is called psychological happiness, what we call nafsi, badani, and khariji, so we therefore will have to accord this the economic theories in our understanding based on this understanding. And of course, it is also historically related to such disciplines such as usul, al-fiqh, that and then also in later times the intentions of the Sharia, what it intends to safeguard, including the theory, the explanation, the conceptual explanation by our usuli scholars about the daruriyat, the hajiyat, and the tahsiniyat. And of course, to return back to the basic ilan, the basic spirit of the Quran about how wealth should not be just regulated amongst the rich, but that it should trickle down to the poor also. So this is, in other words, our notion of development will have to be expanded, and human welfare and all these other aspects are part and parcel of Islamic economic thought and philosophy. The way to do it, of course, there's several schools. So Islamic economics, just like we have, say, Islamic political thought, just as we have Islamic epistemology in present day and time, must be clarified, and then it has to be presented as one of the economic schools. But it is one of the economic schools that promises the greatest amount of happiness in the true sense of the word. Is that all? Do we just have 3 questions today? Oh, sorry, I just checked my WhatsApp, so there's questions here also. So to understanding of welfare in Islam, well, based on what I have just explained about economic thought, it's good if you can begin a reading circle around the books that have been translated by Dr. Adi, of course, which includes that volume in the Ihya, the Adabul Kasb wal Ma'ash, and then there's a single volume in which he puts three different works inside it. I think it is called the Right Livelihood. But again, this is another to properly do justice to it. This is another lecture series. How does the new atheism emerge, and what in terms of Western philosophy facilitated their emergence? But let's just, I think the one that is simpler is this question about the Vienna School. And you said of someone who summarized their thoughts. That person is the Alfred Jules Ayer, the Oxford philosopher, Alfred Jules Ayer, or A.J. Ayer, and his book is called Language, Truth and Logic. It is, I think, one of the most accessible works of philosophy for beginners. Although it has a commitment to the Vienna School, it has a commitment to that reductive theory of meaning, but at the very least, you'll be able to understand, because he uses minimal jargon. Of course, he does use words such as synthetic, a priori, a posteriori, but once you get done with the basic terminologies, you'll be able to understand at least the state of philosophy in the first half of the 20th century. How is the Vienna School different from the Frankfurt School? Well, they are totally different. I mean, in terms of their focus, shall we say. The Vienna School are composed of mainly, people who work in the physical sciences. Their aim is to find a criteria of meaning and to safeguard the scientific findings. So basically, theirs is how to safeguard philosophy of science under the empiricist criteria of meaning. The Frankfurt School, on the other hand, is a school of social research. Their focus is to study society. So Adorno, Habermas, and the likes, including the contemporary Muslim thinker, shall we say, Basam Tibi, was influenced by the Frankfurt School. But theirs is their publications aim at, shall we say, justice in the socio-political realm. In one of the more recent publications of Habermas, he deals with the problem of, say, naturalism and religion within the secular structure. So that is the questions that is asked by the Frankfurt School. But the Frankfurt School also, in the early publications, also question about the notion of rationality, of the Enlightenment and its implications. So it's social philosophy, shall we say? Is its aim, and critical theory likewise. The problem, I suppose, with the remember what I think McIntyre has outlined, and even Maritain, is that these individual schools they tend to commit injustice if they expand their own criteria so as to include other disciplines of knowledge also. So the critical theory, the Frankfurt School, for example, would be illuminating for us to understand, for example, the effects of the Enlightenment on society. To understand, for example, the modern communicative reason and how they all tend towards justice. And all these things are illuminating when we study, say, the Frankfurt School, including, of course, the question of Islamism and Islam. This is their focus. However, with the exception of trying to understand the place of, say, metaphysical theists within, say, the secular age that we live in today, the Frankfurt School cannot give you an answer as to the truth of metaphysical claims. I mean, that's not their department. Analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. Well, these labels, analytic and continental philosophy. Let's look at analytic philosophy first. Analytic philosophy is what Scott Soames, a historian of that tradition, called Analytic philosophy came with the dawn of analysis. The focus of analytic philosophy is to compartmentalize philosophical problems into units, and then to focus on those individual units and to solve them piecemeal. So analytic philosophy, for example, would be a department of philosophy within the university that deals with, say, philosophical questions that emerges within the scientific disciplines. Analytic philosophy will also deal with the question of language, since no other disciplines, with the exception of perhaps linguistics or cognitive science, can handle, for example, the question of, say, in Saul Kripke, I think one of the more well-known proponents of analytic philosophy in our time. Well, Saul Kripke wanted to solve the problem of naming and necessity. What are proper names and what are mere descriptions? In the Islamic intellectual tradition, we had something like this amongst our scholars, wherein they discuss the meaning of definitions, where they distinguish between haddi and rasmi definitions. But Saul Kripke seems to have developed from Wittgenstein that there are certain things which are called necessary names, which are right names, like how water is necessarily H2O. Now these things, our act of naming things, this philosophy of language seems to be a particular, shall we say, preoccupation of analytic philosophy. But they also deal with questions such as the philosophy of mind, and to develop, say, arguments in the analytic tradition to, say, to advance philosophical propositions. Another important thinker is perhaps W.V. Quine. Yes, so Quine, his focus on in one of his most well-known essays, yes, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, is to destroy, for example, the analytic and the synthetic distinction, or the analytic understanding of words, whether they refer properly or not. Gradually, as you look at analytic philosophy, it becomes more and more difficult for the general public, without proper training in the discipline, to understand what they are really concerned about. Meaning to say, as they develop the philosophical questions to such refinements, it becomes far removed from what we expect of philosophy. You said about language reflecting ontology. Can you elaborate? How does it differ from phenomenology? Yes, phenomenology is, for lack of a better description, it is the act of describing what the subject experiences, independently of the status of the object of experience, as discerned from relevant disciplines. Take, for example, yes, the sunset. Yes, the sunset can be explained using, say, optics, the principles of optics, physics, and several other disciplines of knowledge that can reveal the quantitative element of that experience. But yet there is the phenomenological element, is that how it exists as a phenomena that is experienced by our subject. So phenomenology develops this action of describing this very relevant experiences of reality. Phenomenology can be useful in the sociological disciplines also. It can reveal, for example, the experiences which is otherwise unknown by subjects who had a different biological makeup, say, for example, between males and females, between people of different class structure, people of different language and linguistic systems, and so on. But this is not the same as what Professor Alatas is saying about how language reflects ontology. The statement that language reflects ontology is basically a testament of how, when we use language in a certain manner, it is a symbol of the understanding of reality that we accept. There is no act of bracketing involved in language reflecting ontology. Language here becomes a vehicle to express the notion of reality and existence. Now, in this case, language reflecting ontology, the key terms that are used within a language, including the process of the Islamization of and the rise of, say, several other Islamic languages. Now, these languages that are shaped by the process of the formation of the worldview of Islam, they undergo change so as to be able to reflect the ontology of Islam, which is grounded in the Quran. So it is not about of course, there's the subjective element, but in Islam, there is no dichotomy between what the subject reports and what is ontologically subsisting external to the self. MashaAllah, the questions are, yes, you really don't hold back. Number 7, I'm quite confused about romanticism, existentialism, and pragmatism in philosophy. Do you mind shedding some light on this? Well, the school that is romanticism, they rise in response to the Enlightenment, and they in terms of their period, they are about concurrent, meaning to say between the 17th and the 19th century. The romantic or romanticism as a response to Enlightenment philosophy is basically due to the reductionist conception of reality in Enlightenment reason. Enlightenment reason that promotes ratio, that promotes the quantitative study of nature and reality, including the study of society in quantifiable terms, tend to exclude from the experience of phenomena, shall we say, the experience of reality, the aesthetic elements, the element of feeling. And this is particularly detrimental if you read the works of Rousseau, for example, with regards to our conception of man, with regards to our conception of experience, and so on. So that's a brief shedding light of romanticism. Existentialism arose, as we say, it found its roots in Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Existentialism is the concern about the problem of existing, even before the problem of existing in itself. I mean, we now use it in our day-to-day parlance as, for example, a person suffering an existential crisis, where, for example, you start understanding that, just because you are that being suffers from either the threat of nothingness, meaninglessness. So existentialism puts as its primary question, for example, as formulated by Albert Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus, or in the essays that is published together. Camus said that in our time, or perhaps according to him, in all times, even before you answer any other philosophical question about the existence of God, about the status of the universals and so on, the more prior question for him is, why should you live? So existentialism developed out of this ethical quandary, the notion of how or why should you live and how should you live your life. Meaning to say, in Sartre's formulation, it is the problem of freedom that we suffer, the condemnation of freedom, that we ought to fill this life throughout the period that we are living. So that becomes the major preoccupation of the existentialists. So it is more of an ethical philosophy, but it is about a philosophy of being, like that. This is not to be confused with the notion of existence in the Islamic intellectual tradition. As for pragmatism, it had some of its adherents mainly in philosophy in America, particularly as advanced by William James. William James, as a result of his study of the varieties of religious experience and his principles of psychology, understood that that not all truth should be subject to the criteria of correspondence. Some truths are subject to coherence alone without correspondence, meaning to say mathematical truth. Yes, mathematical and a priori truth should not does not require experience to determine its truth. But say scientific claims, now they rely on scientific claim rely on some method of verification. The pragmatist, on the other hand, understands that some very important questions in your life are not susceptible to such verification, are not susceptible even to coherence sometimes. So for William James, he said that for as long as a question is a live option, for example, for the Muslim, yes, for the Shiite, or I mean, for the general Muslim, whether or not the Imam al-Mahdi will come. Now that's a live option because his coming will determine our certain way of life. Whether or not the world will end, whether or not the science as indicated by the Prophet ﷺ in his hadith, that which is constitutive of the fiqh tahawulat, now that's a live option for us. So we must know the answer to that. But of course, we are not pragmatists because we affirm the truth of such statements based on our study of Khabar Sadiq. But for those who have no recourse to the epistemic status of their statement, but yet taking the leap of faith, shall we say, will make a difference in his life. So that the pragmatist will say, now that's a very important question that you cannot simply remain skeptical and suspend judgment about. You need to make a judgment. You need to live life as if it is true, and then hope to be caught, shall we say, and then hope to. So it becomes more of a philosophy of living also in that sense. Now, question 8. Many of us, while studying in university, are exposed to secular humanism and its profound manifesto. What would you think be an appropriate counter-reaction to this? And what do you think are the limits of secular humanism? First, if we recognize, yes, and we realize that we have been exposed to secular humanism, that means we are conscious that secular humanism is but a form of spectacles through which you view the world. Since it is a spectacle, it is a cognitive framework, shall we say, that allows you to judge the world. It is not necessarily the cognitive framework that you need to remain attached with. In other words, that you have the right to question it. In other words, you have the right to question its foundations, its epistemic foundations, its ethical foundations, its metaphysical foundations. So since now that is a very liberating experience, that's why Islamization has been defined as a liberating experience. One of the things that Islamization liberates you from is that it liberates you from secular control of your language and secular control from your reason. Without the process of Islamization, secular humanism determines your usage of language and determines your usage of your thinking, in a sense. The limits of your thinking has been set in that sense. The horizons of your thinking has been set so as to affirm only this world and this realm. So as to affirm, for example, the Protagorean myth that man is the measure of all things. But yet we know, even within the secular humanistic paradigm, there are serious problems with this, that man cannot overcome himself, that man cannot overcome his problem of identity. There's several serious limitations. So the task of critiquing may be your first, shall we say, step. But the liberating process will mean that you must be able to transcend it and to return, to devolve, to evolve into the Islamic state. So not in the external sense, the Islamic state of being, shall we say. This is where Professor Alatas mentions in Historical Fact and Fiction that Islamization is a continuous process that needs to be enacted by conscious Muslims in every generation. So what are the limits? As we said, it's in both these are limiting terms. Yes, secularism is a limiting term because it limits reality to the here and now. Humanism is a limiting term because it limits our ethics, it limits our culture, it limits our metaphysics to the human imagination, to the speculative tradition of mankind, to the formulations of science based on reason and experience alone. But the Quran reveals what man does not know. Yes, Allamal insana ma lam ya'lam. It reveals the existence of an afterlife. It reveals the true reward of those who are righteous. The Quran reveals the identity of who we are. The Quran reveals the truth of the covenant that we once participated in. And this is a liberating exercise because it expands our horizon of reality by limiting it. Limiting it in the sense that we are limited in this life, but at the same time, there is an eternal afterlife that is determined based on our way of living in this life. What do you mean by universal knowledge? Does that mean the liberal arts? And why nowadays in the Muslim world, at least in Nusantara, there are special interests towards Arabic grammar, Nahu? Is it because to counter the rise of language or philosophy or more than that? Well, as for the present interest in Nahu in the Islamic intellectual tradition, that science has, Nahu has been fundamental ever since, shall we say, the time of Sayyidina Ali, when he recognized that due to the exposure of the Arabs with the non-Arabs, meaning to say the exposure to other languages, how that may limit their senses of meaning. What Nahu does as a discipline of knowledge, and Saraf and the several other disciplines of language related to Arabic, is that it expands your meaning. It expands your meaning by limiting the senses of meaning also. In other words, the sciences of Arabic will allow for a greater perception of the Quranic presentation, and we have to pay particular attention to that because our Islamic civilization is based upon that. It's based upon the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is largely also based on word reports. So to be able to understand accurately what they said is a very important process. The significations of the Quran is very important. The significations of the Hadith is very important. But I don't think that, on the other hand, although it is important as a preparatory science, as a propedeutic science, whether or not this move towards grammar is fruitful or not will determine on where you use the result of that. If the result of greater grammar is merely used, for example, to bar others from entering into the discourse, yes, by saying that since you do not know Arabic and you do not know grammar, so therefore whatever you say is suspect, now that's problematic. Secondly, if you only use the greater facility of grammar, but only to enforce the restricted, now this is the internal problem of the Muslims, to enforce and further to further fortify the restriction of knowledge only to the realm of, say, fiqh and the realm of critical hadith studies, but not on the profound elements within the Quran about existence, about the nature of man, about happiness, and so on. Now that too can be detrimental to the development of knowledge. Why presently many people are so attracted to the philosophy of mind, consciousness, and artificial intelligence? Yes, and now, of course, many scholars are attracted to the philosophy of mind, consciousness, and artificial intelligence due to a number of developments in various disciplines. One, of course, is the development of better scanning techniques and better analogs in the development of cognitive science, in the, shall we say, in the rise of computational theory. I think one of the more recent works in consciousness received this impetus because of how, with the development of the machines to its sophisticated structures today, it gives them new means of new models, shall we say, of trying to understand the human mind. And the imaging techniques allows them to understand that different aspects of the brain, shall we say, are different, that they are trying to, I mean, optimistically, they are looking at how um, there are different localities of different experiences, uh, uh, different functions. And so this is in order to fully, I mean, their hope is to probably to fully map out what the brain contains. So certainly, philosophy of mind would be an exciting discipline to be in today. And cognitive science also takes into consideration developments in zoology and the study and better understanding of the animal kingdom and the better understanding of the brain circuitry and structure. So so certainly, philosophy of mind, consciousness, and artificial intelligence would be something that they are keen to fund also out of human hubris. I mean, they conceive that perhaps in the near future, since they have made advances in the realm of say artificial intelligence, at least in beating human beings at the game of chess and certain other very complex cognitive tasks, they think that perhaps they can one day, they can supersede the Turing test. The idea that perhaps you can even create a machine that is capable of sustaining a conversation that you cannot know that you're talking to a machine. So for that, in that they try to suggest that materialism is true. In other words, that therefore human being is but a complex machine. Now that model, I mean, so it seems to tie in very well with the overall zeitgeist in our time, at least before this great reset. Before that, they were pushing towards the fourth industrial revolution and the ever sophistication of machines. So that's where they are attracted in these three disciplines. Alam Jadid. What do you think a seeker of religious knowledge like myself to equip apart from the Usuluddin, which you think is the very important for Usuluddin student? You should consult Professor Naqib Alatas's concept of education. He has, I think, renewed the Maratibul Ulum, the classification of knowledge. Yes, the classification of knowledge, which is considered fardu ain for seekers of knowledge, not for the general public. For the general public, it remains that they have to understand al-i'tiqad, al-fi'l, wa tark, usually summarized as tawheed, fiqh and tasawwuf in order to practice their deen. But for seekers of knowledge, Prof. Alatas has devised this classification of knowledge, that this is that aspect of say Arabic that they have to require, that they are required to have. They have to study, say, the Quran and its sciences, the Hadith and its sciences. They have to study about the Prophet Muhammad, his shama'il, his history, and so on. So there's a checklist, including, of course, Western civilization is part and parcel of what the modern student who wants to advance himself in the field of knowledge ought to learn. What's Islamic philosophical response? Okay, this is answered. Today I was speaking with a friend about studying traditionalists like Rene Guénon and others of same branch. What is important to have in consideration before embarking on opening such books? In my limited understanding, their books can be mixed with ideas which could sometimes carry ideas which could be deeply philosophical, esoteric, and sometimes easily misunderstood. My argument was that one should be grounded firmly in Naqib al-Atas. What would be your point of view? Are these traditionalist philosophers and metaphysicians? Guénon also has a strong critique of modernity, and like many sociologists, is the critique from the traditionalists different in its essence from that of sociologists and philosophers? Yes, of course, the traditionalist is another development of our contemporary philosophy. Well, one thing that the traditionalists and the perennialists appears to have done well is their critique of modernity in its quantitative and reductionistic aspect. I think in his reign of quantity, that element is done very well. Also, their their description of the problem of the wasteland, meaning to say of how modern man has alienated himself. Now, these things are very important. Even Fridtjof Schwann's Logic and Transcendence, I think, contains one of the best critiques of the limitations of Kant's thought. But of course, as you have already pointed out in your question, as Muslims, it's good. It's extremely important to equip yourself with what the arguments that Professor Alatas provides in the Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of Islam about this transcendent unity of religions, about this perennial philosophy, about the true religion. So this thing, I think, is important and paramount. But once you have the ground in the proper ground of understanding what is true religion as opposed to a false one, and what it entails, and you can draw that out in a schematic manner, meaning to say that you understand the implications, then you are able to read the traditionalists even with some profit, because you'll be able to discern that aspects that run contrary to their claim, meaning to say that they have no real epistemic warrant in claiming those things, but at the same time you'll still be able to appreciate some of the critiques that they have done very well with regards to the limitations of especially Enlightenment thinkers. I would read the Perennialists together with the Habermasian and Frankfurt schools critique of the Enlightenment. All right, then I think today we have had a okay. So the question 13, and I suppose that's the last question. The classification of knowledge is given in the concept of education in Islam. Yes, I think I have left question 1, which is how new atheism emerged, and in what terms of Western philosophy facilitated their emergence. If we follow the development, this atheistic strand in Western philosophy has been around for the longest time, perhaps even since Epicurus or even older. These are naturalists. They affirm the eternity of being, shall we say. And in modern times, the one that facilitated this, as already acknowledged by Pope Leo um, in his encyclical, the real problem is the problem of knowledge. Is because the secular intellectuals were able to gather their strength and to form the new cultural hegemony when they monopolize the production of knowledge, and when they exclude religious questions from scientific, theoretical, and from the concern of people, and they remove the theoretical facility that has been provided by the philosophical tradition to justify the claims of religion. And today the problem is exacerbated because of uh, the neoliberal capitalist conception of influence upon the universities that tends to reduce the studying process to a means of just finding employment, and to aim for research grants, and basically it is the reduction of the goal of knowledge to that of economic interest. So therefore it's very difficult for modern day students to understand that philosophy and these disciplines of knowledge which are necessary is about solving human need. Yes, a human need to understand the reality of himself. So this has contributed to the rise of modern atheism. And of course there's other major factors also that has been analyzed in Islam and Secularism by Professor Naqib Alatas. um, As for the difference between analytic and continental philosophy, I've mentioned the analytic tradition the continental tradition, they seem to have, of course, these labels are, are given in a manner so as to distinguish between these two tendencies, but at the same time they mutually influence each other. And at the same time, there are thinkers on the continent who are analytic philosophers, and there are thinkers in England, in the English speaking countries, who are also following the continental tradition. But in short, the continental tradition, will include thinkers such as Martin Heidegger, and the present day left-leaning intellectuals who tend to influence also Western thinkers. Now that's another strand that I have not really mentioned. Those who focus their studies on knowledge as power, and I think they have been deeply influenced by Foucault. And that development of epistemology as a means of strengthening power and hegemony, the sociology of knowledge, shall we say, aside from Foucault, is also developed by Edward Said to expose the limitations of Orientalist scholarship. But maybe more on that as we do more courses in the future. And with that, 13 questions, or perhaps a bit more, even more. I hope I hope I have at least our aim in these past few weeks is to have piqued your interest in leading an exam in life, so as to question systematically about the fundamental problems of living. And if I have done that, I think that would have been a good threshold that I have crossed in this introductory series. But if you are serious students of knowledge, then you should pursue the next levels. Either you want to do it with me in the courses plan with Al-Imla, or you can continue to read on yourselves. But if I may advise you as a fellow Muslim to our brother Muslims, we must always begin with the end in mind, that our study of philosophy or any of this discipline should not become as hijab between ourselves and God. We study it in order to either to understand ourselves better, to understand our religion better, or perhaps to understand our society better, in order that we can hope to end our lives in clarity. And with that, I end this particular series, inshallah, until we meet again. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
صلى الله عليه وسلم